known to many of us as an articulate and passionate Quaker historian. I'll give you a bit of his background. Tom is a native of Newcastle, Indiana. He received his PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University in 1985. In 1987, he joined the faculty at Earlham College, where he served as director of special collections and professor of history, teaching courses in U.S. and British and Quaker history. He retired last year. Luckily, he continues at Earlham as a Quaker scholar in residence. He has written extensively on Quaker history. Some of the titles include The Transformation of American Quakerism, Orthodox Friends from 1800 to 1907, published in 1988. God's Government Begun, the Society for Universal Inquiry and Reform, 1842 to 1846. That was published in 1995. And Earlham College of History, 1847 to 1997. The Quakers in America and Liberal Friends in America in the Long 19th Century, published in 2020. He also edited a collection of Quaker writings, and most recently, the records of Dartmouth Monthly Meeting. His current research project is a book on Quakers and the Civil War. So I urge you to read a lot of these, and especially if Tom leaves you tonight wanting more, there is a way to get more of Tom through his writing. At my ESR installation, I quipped with Tom that he had written so much, I was surprised he still had more to say. Well, remarkably, he always has more to teach us. For this, we are grateful. So let us settle into a rich evening of learning and new understanding. Tom, we welcome and thank you very much. So with that, let us settle into worship, and Tom will speak out of the silence.
Thank you, Gretchen, for that very kind introduction. The title I've chosen for my talk this evening is The Turning Point, American Quakers and Race, 1919 to 1930. Before I get into the substance of that, however, I want to open with an acknowledgement. This paper grows out of research that I did quite a while back in 2007 with 5 Earlham undergraduates: Carrie Black, Amy Spreitzer, Brian Kuzma, Dan Barish, and Will Naismith. All contributed to what you are about to hear. Early in 1924, a New York friend spoke to the Orthodox Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends about race in America. He was blunt. Friends as a whole are not alive to the present conditions, Levi Hollingsworth Wood told his hearers. Friends have an opportunity to lead the rest of the United States. 95% of Black people had lost faith in the white man, Wood warned. Individual friends were interested in and working for various institutions, but he questioned how many members of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting are awake on the whole subject. His conclusion was blunt. Friends inherited the stock of the Underground Railroad, but are not paying dividends on it. I will have more to say later about Hollingsworth Wood. For now, let us consider his critique, which a century later I find sound. One can make a strong argument that the 1920s were the nadir of American Quaker commitment to racial justice. In the South, few Friends questioned racial segregation enforced by law and custom. Indeed, many saw it as a necessity. In the Midwest, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Friends joined the latest incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. And in the East, the overwhelming majority of Quaker schools continued to exclude Black students. Among Friends of all persuasions, whether in Friends General Conference or the 5 Years Meeting, conservative or liberal or evangelical, one finds complaints about apathy and indifference. Hollingsworth Wood was cheered by the experience of the first Black student at Haverford in the autumn of 1924. He believes Friends are entirely clear on the race issue, Wood wrote to another friend. But, Wood continued, I do not agree with him. I see more of the Society of Friends than he does. Still, there was another side to American Quakerism in the 1920s. This was, after all, the decade when African Americans such as Bayard Rustin and Jean Toomer were drawn to or affirmed their society with Friends, their ties with Friends. Prophetic white voices among Friends not only denounced lynching, segregation, and racial hatred, they tried to do something about them. They called Friends to consider the contemporary implications of their abolitionist heritage and how it should be applied. They took action to develop interracial contacts and dialogue. Some of their efforts were merely ameliorative, such as trying to enforce the equal side of separate but equal. But it is clear that by 1930, an influential group of Friends was aware of currents in Black thought, was working with organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and sought to strengthen Black institutions, most particularly for reasons that I will explain later, Fisk University in Nashville. Perhaps most important, by 1930, such Friends saw their relationship with African Americans in egalitarian rather than paternalistic terms. Thus, the foundations were laid for important ties between the American Friends Service Committee and Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 1960s, and the critical role played by the Friends Committee on National Legislation in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's the big picture. For those of you who like roadmaps, let me outline what I will do this evening. I will begin with an overview of the complicated, but more positive than negative history of American Friends and race. We will then look at where Friends were in 1919. From there, we will move on to the limits and failures of Friends in the 1920s. But I will end on a happy note, how leaders had emerged among Friends by 1930 to call Friends to a new commitment to racial justice. The history of Friends and race begins with slavery. For Recently, some friends and historians have felt it proper to emphasize the limits of Quaker anti-slavery. It is true that before 1750, many Friends were enslavers, and Friends disowned some unruly critics of Quaker slaveholding, most notably Benjamin Lay. While Quakers urged kindly treatment of slaves, they were slow to think of them as having the potential to become friends themselves. Such criticism is valid, but acknowledging the limits of Quaker anti-slavery should not blind us to how pioneering and radical Quaker opposition to the institution of slavery was. Friends were among the first people in the Western world to question an institution that had existed in varied forms since the dawn of human civilization. Friends in 1688 issued the first anti-slavery statement in American history. They were the first religious group to rule that members who owned slaves must emancipate them. Hundreds of Friends did so, often at a significant financial sacrifice. And as an anti-slavery movement developed in North America and the British Isles after 1750, Friends were leaders. When the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1833, about a third of its charter members were Friends. Contrary to Quaker hopes, it took a civil war to end slavery in the United States between 1861 and 1865. Quaker responses to that war were complex. Some Friends supported what they perceived as a war against slavery. Many others felt themselves called to the support of the millions of newly freed people in the South, in schools, orphanages, and hospitals, or by collecting food and clothing and money for the destitute. Friends called on northern state legislatures and the United States Congress to give the freed people equal rights under law. Here in Indiana, for example, an equal rights petition to the state legislature in 1865 marked the first time that Orthodox and Hicksite Friends had ever worked together. By the early 20th century, this fervor had largely faded. Many yearly meetings still listed colored people as one of their philanthropic concerns. A few maintained formal ties with Black schools in the South. For the Orthodox Indiana yearly meeting, it was Southland Institute in Arkansas. Philadelphia Orthodox Friends controlled the Christiansburg Industrial Institute in Virginia, as well as the Cheney Training School for Teachers in Pennsylvania, and New York Orthodox Friends, the High Point Normal and Industrial Institute in North Carolina. Hicksite Friends supported schools they founded in South Carolina, the Schofield and Lang Institutes. The most important development between 1900 and 1920 was the endowment of the Jeans Foundation with a $1 million gift from Philadelphia Hicksite friend Anna T. Jeans in 1907. It provided support for hiring teachers for rural Black schools. It was the first major educational foundation in the United States whose board included Black members. But Friends at the time admitted their efforts were limited. Handed was a report to New England Yearly Meeting in 1922. Your Committee on Freedmen does nothing itself except sign away the income from the bequests of our ancestors. Why had this happened? I see three things. The first was a sense that with the abolition of slavery, Friends had finished their work. It was now time for Black people to take care of themselves. The second was a sense that others needed help more. It is not coincidence, I think, that as Friends became Indian agents and took responsibility for, quote, civilizing Native Americans on an unprecedented scale in the 1870s, that their commitment to support of the free people decreased. The final factor was the growing influence of holiness and premillennialism among the pastoral majority of Friends from the 1870s onward, what by 1920 had hardened into fundamentalism. Friends with such views, particularly that the second coming of Christ was imminent, and as many souls as possible must be saved before the world came to an end, meant emphasizing evangelism rather than philanthropy or reform. After all, staying out of hell was more important than trying to reform a world irreparably deformed by sin. There is ample evidence that many American Friends shared at least some of the racial attitudes and embraced at least some of the racial prejudices of the larger American society. Joseph Swain, the president of Swarthmore College from 1904 to 1921, wrote that, quote, progress had come chiefly from the Nordic race. A friend at a conference here at Earlham in 1924 stated, the white race, by virtue of its superior brain power, has dominated other races. Doubtless with good intentions, a writer in the Hicksite Friends Intelligencer said that Black people, quote, are children still. A survey by the Home Mission Board of the 5 Years meeting in 1927 found numerous examples of racial prejudice. Typical, at a summer missionary conference about 4 years ago, a fine young Negro girl came to the Friends Girl Camp as one of the delegates. One or two of the other delegates would not occupy the same tent with her. A Philadelphia friend in 1931 responded thus to appeals for racial justice. I am willing for them, the Negroes, to have greater opportunities and privileges, but I can't stand it to hear that they are our equals. At Haddonfield Monthly Meeting in New Jersey in 1927, Rachel Davis Du Bois, of whom I will have more to say later, was told that Jim Crow cars aren't bad at all and that Blacks are happy in them. The clerk of the monthly meeting, who was also the county superintendent of schools, said that he doubted that there was a problem with segregated schools, that, quote, educational opportunities are equal in the South. Oh, the utter ignorance of Friends on race relations, Du Bois concluded. My telling them facts does not convince them. When the last lynching in the northern United States took place in Marion, Indiana in August 1930, it was in a county with a large Quaker population. Yet when Milton Hadley, a local Friends pastor, brought the matter before the Orthodox Indiana Yearly Meeting a month later, other Friends from the area adamantly opposed making any statement other than a general condemnation of lawlessness that did not mention lynching. Black Quakers were rare, although not unknown in the United States in the 1920s. Interestingly, I have found no one who connected the flourishing Quaker missionary work in Kenya with racial attitudes in the United States. There was one entirely Black monthly meeting at Southland, Arkansas, but it was unique. One of the most poignant stories I have heard on this score was told to me a number of years ago by Ernestine Lucas, a Black woman who grew up here in Richmond in the 1920s. She lived near the East Main Street Meeting House and knew that her great-grandparents had been members there. But when she told her mother that she would like to attend, she was told, no, they don't want you there. And she concluded 70 years later, my mother was probably right. The record of Quaker schools on race was uneven. In the Midwest Friends University, and in Iowa, the Cleveland Bible Institute, Earlham, and the remaining Quaker academies admitted Black students. We know little about their experiences. Earlham's first Black graduate, Clarence Cunningham, class of 1924, remembered a series of indignities, but also support from faculty. He concluded that, all in all, he found Earlham, quote, a pleasant place, which says as much about Indiana in the 1920s as it does about Earlham. And he was impressed enough by Friends to remain one the rest of his life. Quaker schools in Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, North Carolina, and Tennessee abided by legal segregation requirements. Friendsville Academy in Tennessee used as a fundraising pitch that it served, quote, worthy American pure Anglo-Saxon boys and girls. By 1920, or in 1920, none of the Philadelphia area schools and colleges admitted Black students. One friend acervically commented, if Negro children would present themselves for registration at certain select, very select schools of Philadelphia Friends, the administration would promptly suffer a stroke of apoplexy. Haverford was the first to bend. In 1922, it would be 1945 before Westtown admitted a Black student. Some friends defended racial segregation. Their thinking was laid out by Clara I. Cox, a North Carolina pastor who was clerk of the yearly meetings Committee on Interracial Goodwill. Quote, segregation is the settled policy of the South toward the Negro. Segregation leading to separate schools, separate churches, separate residential districts, etc. Segregation may be and often is unkind and unchristian. That it is possible to make segregation kind and Christian is the position taken by North Carolina friends. We believe that God indeed made of one blood all races, but we also believe that he has established certain bounds for the race. The practice of having separate schools and churches and other institutions does not necessarily work a hardship upon the Negro. Rather, such separation tends to develop Negro leadership and initiative. What Cox feared most was anything that might lead to racial intermarriage, which she labeled unwise and disastrous. And that was the justification most often advanced by opponents of integrating Quaker schools. As Gertrude Jacob, a New York friend, summed up, there is danger in the non-segregated school. When Negroes and whites are together, there is danger in the results of sex attraction with intermarriage. For many today, the most horrifying discovery about Friends in this period is that hundreds, perhaps thousands, joined the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana between 1920 and 1925. There is much that we will probably never know, as documentary evidence is extremely limited, and after the Indiana Klan spectacularly collapsed amidst criminality and corruption in 1925, friends who had been members were not inclined to remember or speak of it. At least 3 recorded ministers in Indiana Yearly Meeting, the pastoral body, were known to be members. One of them, Daisy Douglas Barr, was actually head of the National Klan Women's Auxiliary. It is important to keep in mind certain facts, and here I seek to explain, not to extenuate. One is that while the Indiana Klan was certainly a racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist group, and intended its marches and demonstrations to be intimidating, it was not generally violent. Unlike its southern counterparts, it lynched no one. James H. Madison of Indiana University, in a recently published book on the Indiana Klan, concludes that in Indiana, its primary target was immigrants, especially Roman Catholics. In some places, it was even a perversely progressive force. Here in Indiana, for example, or here in Richmond, for example, it led the campaign to stop the sale of the municipally owned city electric plant to private investors. And it doubtless attracted many church members because of its uncompromising support for prohibition. Still, the appeal of the Klan shows profound indifference about racism and racial justice among many Indiana friends. And Indiana was not alone. At the Rose Hill Friends Church in Kansas, a Klan group visited services in 1924 and presented the pastor with money. He thanked them and, quote, made a few remarks to the gratification of the Klansmen. So there was much to be done among American friends in the 1920s. And by 1920, leaders were appearing to do that. They included Levi Hollingsworth Wood in New York, Esther Morton Smith, Agnes Tierney, John T. Emlin, Robert T. Curlin, and Rachel Davis Du Bois in the 2 Philadelphia yearly meetings, Walter C. Woodward and Clarence Pickett here in Indiana, Tom Jones at Fisk University, and yes, Clara I. Cox in North Carolina. Each of these could be the subject of an entire lecture. I will talk about four whose work I find illustrative: Wood, Du Bois, Cox, and Jones. Hollingsworth Wood, he never went by his first name, was a New York City attorney and Haverford graduate, born in 1870. His father, James Wood, was the longtime clerk of the Orthodox New York Yearly Meeting, who presided at the landmark Richmond Conference of 1887. But Hollingsworth Wood married a Philadelphia Hicksite friend, and in 1926 requested to become a member of Swarthmore Monthly Meeting, while retaining his membership in the Orthodox New York Yearly Meeting, of which he was the clerk. Wood was a founder of the American Civil Liberties Union and served as president of the National Urban League. For many years, he was also a member of the Fisk University Board of Trustees. There, he played a critical role in 1925 in easing out a president whom critics perceived as harsh and racist, and replacing him with a Quaker. Carter G. Woodson, the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, on the board of which Wood served, called him a man who has made himself so useful that his name has become associated with the movement for social uplift across the country. In a speech to an interracial conference in 1924, Wood said that as an attorney, he would be hard-pressed to make a case before God for the white race. 1/10 of our population has largely lost faith in the 9/10, and every dispassionate student must admit that their case for loss of faith is a powerful one. Judgment, he concluded, was inevitable. It was pure coincidence that Rachel Davis, born to a Quaker family in southern New Jersey in 1892, married an accountant named Nathan S. Du Bois. She would become a close friend and coadjutor of W.E.B. Du Bois, the towering African-American activist and intellectual, so much so that by 1928 he was introducing her playfully at conferences as Mrs. Du Bois. By 1920, she was active in the women's suffrage movement and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It was Hollingsworth Wood who introduced her to racial issues, and she professed herself ashamed by how little she knew about Black people. She quickly educated herself and made herself a mainstay of the General Conference Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on the Interests of Colored People. Attracted to socialism, she also became a friend of another prominent Black activist, A. Philip Randolph. Teaching at Woodbury High School in New Jersey, she used the school assembly program and her own civics and social studies classes to acquaint students with racism and pacifism. By 1927, the local American Legion was demanding her firing. Significantly, a school official told her that she could get away with discussing peace in school, but not race. I earlier introduced Clara I. Cox of North Carolina as an apologist for segregation. It would be unjust to leave it at that. Born in 1879, her father, J. Elwood Cox, was a prominent High Point, North Carolina businessman and a Republican candidate for governor in 1908. Clara graduated from Guilford College in 1902 and subsequently studied at Columbia University. She served as the assistant clerk of North Carolina Yearly Meeting of the 5 Years Meeting body. She was for many years the clerk of the Yearly Meeting Interracial Relations Committee. In 1930, she was elected a member of the Committee on Interracial Cooperation, probably the most ambitious civil rights organization in the South before the Civil Rights era. It did not directly challenge racial segregation, but it did call for 1, complete eradication of lynching, 2, an end to the use of appeals to racial prejudice in political campaigns, and 3, improvement of Black school conditions. Cox helped organize interracial Sundays, found scholarship money for students at Bennett College in Greensboro, and tried to further interracial communication. In the same article in which she defended segregation, she also called, quote, the doctrine of the inherent superiority of the white race absurd and fallacious. The Anglo-Saxon needs to get rid of this feeling of superiority. North Carolina Friends were, she concluded, not only for but with the Negro, to the end that all unjust discriminations may be abolished and a Black man and his children may have every right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My fourth illustrative friend is an Earlham alumnus, Thomas Elsa Jones, known to everyone as Tom. A native of Fairmount, Indiana, from a long line of Quaker ancestors, he had graduated from Earlham in 1912, already a recorded minister. He then entered Hartford Seminary, where he joined such future Quaker luminaries as Alexander Purdy and Clarence Pickett. From Hartford, he went on to do doctoral work in sociology and anthropology at Columbia University, while also serving as field secretary of the Young Friends movement. With the outbreak of World War I, he went to work for the American Friends Service Committee. At the end of the war, because his fiancée, Esther Balderston, had committed herself to teaching in Friends schools in Japan, he took a similar position there. There, he wrote his dissertation on racial diversity in Japan, a work that was a comprehensive assault on ideas of genetic and hereditary racial superiority. At this point, Hollingsworth Wood once again enters our narrative. As already noted, Wood was a member of the board of Fisk University in Nashville, and in 1926 was central to its search for a new president. He brought Jones to the board's attention, and Jones felt called to the position. Many Fisk alumni and students had hoped for a Black president, but Jones appears to have won over most doubters. One told Jones that he was the blackest white man I have ever known. Within 5 years, Jones had erased Fisk's debt, increased its endowment, hired outstanding Black scholars like Charles S. Johnson for the faculty, and made Fisk the first fully accredited Black college in the South. He also attracted idealistic friends to join him at Fisk. In his inaugural address, Jones said that Fisk could be a holy experiment in brotherhood. One of the Quaker administrators wrote that it was, quote, a joy to work in this group at Fisk. Here we have committed ourselves to judge by personal worth rather than by color, and we do not have to waste our energy trying to decide whether we can afford to eat with a Negro or to have him visit us in our homes. It is when we leave the campus that we feel that stifling wave of discrimination, which saps the lifeblood from so many people all over the world. Looking at these friends and their coadjutors, several commonalities are clear. One is that they were theological and social liberals. They carried the attitudes of the early 20th century gospel into the 1920s of racial justice as part of the advancement of the kingdom of God. Robert T. Kurlan got himself fired from both Virginia Military Institute and Westchester State College, the former for a letter to the nation in which he defended Black farmers in Arkansas who had used force to defend themselves from white rioters, the latter for acting as faculty sponsor of the campus Liberal Club. Kurlan had compounded outrage at VMI by hiring 2 Black attorneys to sue the school over his firing. Rachel Davis Du Bois saw the point of Quaker education as inculcating liberal attitudes in children. Walter C. Woodward, the General Secretary of the 5 Years Meeting and editor of the American Friend, was the focus of decades of attacks from fundamentalist friends. One of the articles he published in the American Friend in 1926 speaks volumes. It quoted educational surveys as saying that Babbitt-like parents and 100% Americanism hindered progress and racial understanding. In New York, it was noted of centenarian friend Emily Howland, whose interest in Black rights went back to the 1840s, that she ignored the divisions of Friends, unconcerned about theology. Hollingsworth Wood's joint membership in both the 5 Years meeting and Friends General Conference has already been noted. These friends were aware of developments of Black thought in the 1920s. They paid attention to movements like the Pan-African Conference, Black leaders like W.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke, and organizations like the NAACP. They recognized the impact of World War I. "We return fighting" was the motto of Black activists who felt that a world war fought to make the world safe for democracy meant justice at home. In 1920, the FGC Philadelphia Yearly Meeting noted, "The Negro race has been long suffering in the past. They have returned from their schooling in war as certified warriors. Their demand is citizenship." Traveling in the South, Walter C. Woodward found a rising tide of self-consciousness, of self-determination among the Negroes. Tom Jones recognized that the day of Black education focused on manual skills that both Southern whites and Northern philanthropists had emphasized since the 1880s was past. The Negro was, quote, "no longer content to remain a manual worker. He is going to own a home, pay his taxes, own an automobile, and be an American citizen like all the rest. If he is to find himself on the best level, he must have the same training as an average American citizen. This means college education for many Negroes." This answers the question of who. There remains the question of why. Two things were critical. The first was a combination of awareness of developments of African Americans and the weight of Quaker history. In an illuminating article about his own experiences in 1924, a friend put at the head of the things that influenced his thinking and feeling about race, quote, "stories by my father and mother in their part in the Underground Railroad." Albert Russell, Earlham alumnus and former faculty member who had moved on to the experimental Woolman School in Philadelphia, said in 1919, "Social advance and Quaker history are inseparable. It is a religion that can't sit by while our brother suffers." The Orthodox Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Committee on Race Relations told Friends in 1924 that they had a special responsibility to lead and mold the sentiment of the community in matters pertaining to the Negro, so that adjustments may come in a Christian spirit of love and cooperation. Rachel Davis Du Bois was characteristically blunt at the FGC gathering in 1928. "Times have changed since the days of our grandmothers, who in philanthropic spirit gave food and clothing to Negroes. Perhaps we need more wisdom and more real goodness now. We must stop doing and saying for the Negro in order to work with the Negro. In this, there must be new sacrifice and new sufferings, a new abolition movement to free us from our prejudices." The other factor was the creation of the American Friends Service Committee in 1917. Formed to provide pacifist Friends with an alternative to military service when the United States entered World War I, the AFSC won worldwide attention and praise for its humanitarian relief work in Europe during and after the war. Not all Friends were enthusiastic. Many evangelicals saw it as a distraction from the more vital work of saving perishing souls. But supporters perceived in it a renewed Quakerism. We used to hear much about the decay of Quakerism, but since the beginning of the Great War, there has come to us new life and unity, wrote Friends Intelligencer editor Henry Ferris in 1923. The work that Friends have done abroad has saved their life here and at home. The General Conference Indiana Yearly Meeting agreed. We have established a worldwide reputation for disinterested philanthropy. Now let us use our influence to help our own people keep our reputation as the friend of the colored people. Uniformly, the Friends who in the 1920s articulated a new vision of racial equity and justice supported making the AFSC a permanent organization. And in turn, they wanted to make racial justice one of its concerns. I'm not sure that it is useful to try to decide whether these friends qualify as anti-racist. Applying theoretical categories from the 2020s to the 1920s can obscure as much as it illuminates. But these friends undertook a variety of activities that advocated the rights of Black people, attacked discrimination, and called friends to adapt older testimonies to changing circumstances. The Quaker attack on racism began with attempts to draw attention to the accomplishments of African Americans. Ann Biddle Sterling of Philadelphia wrote in 1921, "No tale of romance is more thrilling than the record of the rise of this people from a bondage without literacy or property or self-confidence, a rise so rapid that history holds no similar record, to the position of dignity in industry, art, agriculture, science, and literature that they are now achieving." Walter C. Woodward, noting the increase in Black farm ownership, concluded, "For a race that was practically landless and penniless when it was emancipated 60 years ago, this showing is truly remarkable. It could have been achieved only by a degree of energy, thrift, and sacrifice that is heartily commendable." Friends in Illinois Yearly Meeting in 1929 heard in a report from the philanthropic community a most interesting and enlightening resume of the progress of the Negro race during the past 15 years, showing an amazing development and rise in class consciousness. Individuals like Leslie P. Hill, the head of Cheney School, were profiled in Quaker journals. Hill was a graduate of Harvard, an honor student, a member of Phi Beta Kappa, which marks him as a scholar worthy of association with Harvard's known scholars. It is cause for thankfulness that this man, equipped for leadership, is a recognized power endowed with wisdom and strength. Friends decried the practice of newspapers to highlight race in stories that involve Black crime, but not Black accomplishment. Central to the new Quaker approach to race relations was what was referred to at the time as interracial work, bringing white and Black people together in a variety of settings. Glenn Roberts, the pastor of the Brooklyn Friends Church, saw this as simply carrying out the teachings of Christ. When we place ourselves outside the circle of any other human being, we deny our sonship with the God who is the Father of all. The FGC Philadelphia Yearly Meeting argued in 1921, when the members of two races work together, prejudice dies a natural death. A decade later, in a statement that was revealing in more ways than one, it said, "The best way to fight prejudice was to get in touch with fine, educated, sensitive colored people and bring them into our circle of friendship." Such contacts were in the best interests of all. The Orthodox Philadelphia Race Relations Committee heard from the Black folklorist Arthur Fawcett in 1925. "Too many of the best type of both races have been indifferent to things that do not affect them personally, and in the meantime, the unstable elements are being influenced by questionable leaders." Interracial contacts took a variety of forms. Both the 5 Years Meeting and Friends General Conference encouraged Friends to participate in interracial worship services. In 1919, Iowa City was tense because a Black sorority had purchased a house in a white neighborhood near the University of Iowa, the best part of town. Anna D. Starbuck, hearing of the insults and abuse the young Black women were facing, pointedly invited them to tea at her own home and called at the sorority house. In the spring of 1921, Hannah Clothier Holt, well known as a feminist and peace activist, hosted an interracial gathering at her Swarthmore home to hear Orthodox friend Esther Morton Smith report on her visit to 6 Southern governors to present an address on lynching. In 1926, friends in Berkeley, California, heard the only Black teacher in the Oakland schools on the race question from a Negro point of view. In 1927, a group of Baltimore friends visited Black schools, nurseries, settlement houses, the YMCA, and offices of the Baltimore Afro-American, concluded by dining in a, quote, small colored restaurant with faculty from Morgan State College. If only some more of these goodwill tours could be made with more people taking part, much misunderstanding would be wiped out, wrote one of the participants. Meeting together like this in such a friendly way, all race differences are forgotten. In the spring of 1926, 100 Philadelphia friends held a dinner with 100 Black citizens of the city. Although the Philadelphia Friends account claimed that the race problem was forgotten in the pleasure of friendly intercourse, those present heard Black speakers decry prejudice and discrimination. Friends also interacted with African Americans in more structured settings, especially the interracial conferences that became more common in the 1920s. Friends sponsored and attended a variety of such conferences. In November 1922, for example, the Race Street Meeting House in Philadelphia was the setting for a conference on proper interracial contacts in schools. The Pennsylvania Superintendent of Public Instruction pledged to put a Black man on his staff, and Alice Dunbar Nelson, the widow of the Black poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, spoke on the importance of teaching modern sociology squarely. 2 years later, Swarthmore College professor Jesse H. Holmes presided at the Third Philadelphia Interracial Conference. Friend Frederick J. Libby denounced the Ku Klux Klan, while Morehouse College president John Hope showed the immorality of segregation. That summer, Hope and Ann Biddle Sterling led a Friends General Conference roundtable to discuss segregation, intermarriage, and inequality. In 1927, East Coast Friends met in Washington, D.C. to discuss the relationship of the races. Attenders heard Howard University President Mordecai Johnson advocate that, quote, the Black man who controlled, or excuse me, the white man who controlled business, school, or YMCA should introduce Negroes according to their ability, even to the point of crucifixion. Or in other words, even though the organization should be destroyed by the experiment. Some friends were fierce and uncompromising in denouncing the Ku Klux Klan, and they spanned the Quaker spectrum. Philadelphia Orthodox Friends in 1922 sent delegations to the governors of Pennsylvania and Delaware to ask them to oppose it. The Hicksite Friends intelligencer approvingly quoted The Nation that the Klan exploits local prejudices and throughout the country fosters class oppression and persecution. Since it bears the name of a terrorist organization of the past and has adopted all the current class prejudices, it invites rowdies of all description. Iowa conservative friends reminded their members of the longstanding Quaker testimony against secret societies and that they be careful not to surrender their conscience to the keeping of another. Homer L. Cox, an Ohio pastor who can be described only as fundamentalist, was scathing. The miserable caricature of justice, which masquerades behind bed sheets and false faces in the name of law enforcement, is too cowardly for the Christian. Darkness and secrecy are conditions in which all kinds of race hatreds and class strife thrive. Walter C. Woodward called the Klan a leprous social disease. he deplored its growth in Indiana. Whatever may be the national ills to which this night riding order addresses itself, and whatever the scattering instances of good accomplishment here and there, the whole spirit and basis of the movement are thoroughly pernicious. It is essentially divisive and anarchic. It breeds suspicion and flouts the very law it pretends to uphold. It thrives in soil so deep in hate. A distemper of the mind and a perversion of the heart must be created for the flowering of this noxious night-riding, blooming Sirius. It was, Woodward concluded, the shame of Indiana. And the Pastoral Indiana Yearly Meeting minuted an uncompromising denunciation in 1922. The Ku Klux Klan, by hiding behind a mask, is un-American, by its antagonism to a church is unchristian, and by its fostering and fomenting race hatred is unpatriotic. Therefore, we would advise our members not to join it or in any way assist in its work. Emulating John Woolman, Esther Morton Smith felt led to travel to Atlanta in 1922 to try to labor with the head of the National Klan, Hiram Wesley Evans. When no answer came to her letter trying to arrange an appointment, she did not give up. Learning that Evans was to be in Washington, D.C., she copped a train there, only to find that he had left before she arrived. Friends were also outspoken in condemning lynching, which California Friends called this disgraceful evil. The Friends intelligencer argued that Friends' tradition in interracial work give them a special opportunity to lead in this cause. The whole nation is discredited and disgraced, and every word we say about human rights and civilization is laughed at by Europeans who know of the lynching evil in our country, wrote novelist Dorothy Canfield Fisher in 1919. Here in Richmond, the American Friend editorialized, the sin and evil of mob violence in America has become a burden upon our conscience, a stain upon our national honor, and a menace to our law and order. Friends of all persuasions called for legislation to make lynching a federal crime. Another vital aspect of Quaker advocacy of equal rights was attacking theories of racial superiority. A survey of the most carefully gathered data on the character of races revealed little evidence for belief in the inherent superiority of one race over another, a group of young Quaker leaders, including Tom Jones, stated in 1930. In fact, the term race has never been defined satisfactorily, nor its limits determined. Students at the innovative Woolman School heard lectures on how recent scholarship was likely to be destructive to some of our prejudices and will open up whole new ranges of ideas, and that most of the essential factors in our culture seem to have originated in Asia and Africa. Educated Negroes have demonstrated they can achieve what any other group can with the same opportunities, the Friends Intelligencer editorialized. By what God-given right does our authority, does the white race assert superiority over other races? An Erland student asked in 1920. Our racial snobbishness seems to me one of the most unchristian expressions of our modern civilization. With the exception of Clara Cox, these friends were forthright in condemning racial segregation. In a moving article in the American Friend in 1922, Walter C. Woodward wrote of his consternation when a Black official of the Urban League called on him. Woodward usually took such visitors to lunch, but he realized that none of the restaurants he patronized here in Richmond would serve his guests. Later the same day, he attended a meeting that included a Black children's choir singing America the Beautiful. He was distraught when he realized what wilderness of race prejudice, of exploitation, of cruel buffetings, of crushed hopes awaited those boys and girls singing so heartily of American the beautiful. By 1930, these friends sought to hold meetings at hotels that would serve Black patrons. The two most innovative Quaker institutions of this period, the Woolman School and its successor, Pendle Hill, were both intentionally integrated. At Fisk, one friend predicted that future generations would pity her contemporaries for their stupidity and blindness of racial segregation. Philadelphia friend Lloyd Balderston rejoiced that many earnest Christians are coming to see that segregation and other forms of discrimination cannot be reconciled with Christian standards. These friends met head on what many saw as the most powerful argument against integration, that it would lead to interracial marriage. Wilbur K. Thomas, the head of the AFSC, dismissed it as a bogey. Tom Jones insisted that Black people, quote, were not interested in it. They are interested in securing industrial equality, in being able to get something to eat when away from home, and in being allowed to sleep in a Pullman car when traveling. Others pointed out that laws against intermarriage did not prevent white men from exploiting Black women. One friend noted that racial mixing was supposed to be demoralizing. Yet those with such views were quick to argue that distinguished African Americans became distinguished because of their, quote, white blood. Rachel Davis Du Bois was characteristically pointed. I believe that the average person in all races prefers his own kind, but there are a few exceptions. Sincere affection is an individual matter, and preventing such marriage is forcing these people to live without the law or to run away to escape it. Unsurprisingly, these friends saw in the AFSC a vehicle for work with the Negro. In March 1924, Hollingsworth Woods spoke to a general meeting of the AFSC, warning that a real hatred of the whites was growing among Black people in the United States, and arguing that the AFSC was the proper vehicle for Quaker action to counter racial animosity. This was at a time when the AFSC had decided to expand its work beyond relief, beyond war and famine relief. An interracial section was established. Its activities were varied. It investigated the number of Black Quakers, finding almost none in the United States, but thousands overseas. The section also sponsored a series of conferences designed to bring educated Negroes and educated white people together. Results were uneven. A conference in Greensboro, North Carolina in March 1928 attracted only a few local friends. A survey of Quaker attitudes on race revealed much that was disturbing, ranging from lack of interest to emphatic opposition by friends to allowing people of other races to join their meetings or even attend them regularly. The section remained convinced that interracial work broke down prejudice and that exposing friends to talented Black people could do that. So in 1927, it hired a traveling lecturer, Crystal Bird, who would later become the first Black woman to serve in the Pennsylvania State Senate. Walter C. Woodward called her a flaming, radiant soul. In 1927-28, Bird gave over 200 speeches in the Philadelphia area and the Midwest. She combined analysis of racial prejudice with singing spirituals, since, she argued, many people have been reached through the message of music. Although the program ended with another reorganization in 1929, historian Alan Austin concludes that it laid the foundation of significant future work. Heartening also are scattered incidents that show our desire to do the right thing. Esther Morton Smith tried to persuade theater owners in Philadelphia to stop showing the virulently racist film, The Birth of a Nation. In at least one case, she succeeded. When a Black family moving into a white neighborhood in Detroit in 1925 faced harassment, the NAACP and the mayor asked friends to mediate. There was the staff of the Schofield School in South Carolina, referring to Black employees as Mr. and Mrs. There was the Black school head in Georgia, remembering that it was the Quaker who was the first white man who addressed him as Mr. There were white teachers at Southland Institute outraging local whites by dining with Blacks. There were friends of Bloomingdale, Indiana, who in 1927 became aware that the 3 Black families in the community had received threatening letters ordering them to move away. The monthly meeting reached out to offer support to the families and issued a public condemnation of the threats. And there's a bit of my own family history. In 1922, my great-grandfather James B. Hamm was a dairy farmer outside Newcastle, Indiana. He sold his milk to local restaurants and groceries. Many of his customers were Klan members who pressured him to join. He refused, even though he lost many of those customers, and his older son had to quit school and go to work to help support the family. I do not know as much as I'd like to know about how Black people regarded Friends at this time. A keyword search of several digitized African American newspapers for this period reveals little. Friends understandably highlighted praise, like the Black man attending Philadelphia yearly meeting sessions in 1929, who told those there, "To my mind, you are the grandest example of the Lord's work I ever saw." A Black man here in Richmond in 1920 offered a bit of poetry. "I am content, my hopes are not forlorn. I have no wish to criticize my Maker. 'Twas best I should have been a Negro born. Next best, I've been a white man and a Quaker." When asked point blank in 1923 about the minds of some colored people concerning Friends, Leslie P. Hill responded that he perceived, quote, "a feeling that they have, after all, never really known these Quakers, that they have come across to them with help or encouragement, and then gone back, in a word, worked for them rather than with them." In 1924, Morehouse College president John Hope was pointed. "No, I cannot say that these Quakers at present are in the van of this movement. In fact, I hardly know what to think their position is. They do not seem to be in a decisive position." Friends who advocated change shared such frustration. When it comes to the Quaker testimony in regard to sacredness of personality, as it regards to interracial matters, a lot of Friends in Indiana yearly meeting are extremely heretical, was the unhappy comment of a frustrated Willis Beatty after the failure to condemn the Marion lynching explicitly in 1930. Although Hollingsworth Wood wrote that he would be glad to see half the meeting house in America mortgaged to save the Southland Institute in 1924, Friends could not raise the money. New York Hicksite Friends confessed in 1922 that resources once devoted to Black schools were now going to overseas relief. That same year, Illinois yearly meeting agreed, "On account of the urgent calls for relief in other fields, our members have not contributed the same amount to the work for colored people." At a 1931 Young Friends conference, there was a fear that such failures reflected that too many Friends were just accidental friends. Friends because of family ties, or because the Friends were the popular or dominant church in their small towns, ignorant of Quaker history, and indifferent to the testimonies of Friends. Still, by 1930, a fundamental change had taken place. Quaker work for racial justice remained decentralized, a combination of individual concerns and efforts by committees at the monthly, quarterly, and yearly meeting levels. By 1932, the AFSC had returned to work on racial issues. And with the formation of the Friends Committee on National Legislation in 1943, came a venue for Quaker efforts to dismantle the legal foundations of white supremacy in the United States. Friends like Hollingsworth Wood and Rachel Davis Du Bois were in many ways lonely prophets, but then so were others who were in the vanguard of work for change among Quakers in the past. As painful as we find accounts of Quaker racism a century ago, it is worth remembering that we usually know of it because other friends were noting, critiquing, and rebuking it. I find it a tribute to Friends that by 1929, a politically savvy activist was advising Philadelphia Friends to allow a sympathetic Presbyterian to lead in outreach to other denominations. The other churches are getting a little tired of being told what to do by the Quakers. Sometimes Friends are at their best when they are being tiresome.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. That was a masterful. So I'm gonna just ask us to take a moment to sit with that for a minute. And then if you have a comment, a question, or if you just wanna clap your hands like my friend Bradsman, use the raise your hand feature, and then we will just follow those and ask Tom to respond.
Do you want to call on people or shall I, Brown?
I'm happy to do that. Go ahead, Betsy.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom, as always, full of interesting connections. I might say, jumping back into the earlier period, those of us who were working on Quaker involvement in the indigenous boarding schools keep finding people who in the 1870s and 80s are involved in the indigenous boarding schools and providing leadership in that, who either they or their parents taught at freedmen schools. And one of my kind of working hypotheses is that Friends mapped their experience in the freedmen schools onto indigenous communities where it did not fit. So that's complicates all of this. What I'm curious about in your thinking about why things shifted by the end of the 20s, what is the impact of the Great Migration? So that Friends in New York, in Chicago, in Detroit, there's a much bigger and robust African American community in those places than there would have been in 1910.
That's an excellent question. And these friends are very much aware of the Great Migration. They're pointing out that by 1920, Philadelphia has the second largest African American population of any city in the United States. And that raises a couple of issues for them. First of all, they are aware that many of these migrants are unskilled and illiterate, and that is a problem that Friends have had some experience working with in the past. On the other hand, I just don't find much evidence that friends in Chicago are paying a lot of attention to what's happening on the South Side. Now, I haven't worked a lot with Chicago records, and it may be that they were doing things that don't show up in the Friends Intelligencer or the American Friend. One thing I did find striking that I didn't have time to include here was that in 1919, the Pastoral Chicago Friends meeting put its meeting house up for sale and moved to a new neighborhood because the neighborhood where the old meeting house was had become almost entirely Black.
The same is true in Boston.
Yeah.
At
So
about the
I
same
think there's a lot
age.
that could be explored there.
Yeah.
Any other comments or question? Sheila?
Hold on a second. Wanted to say hello. I'm wondering, listening to this, if friends here as well as friends then knew about the relationship of the word lynching to Quakers, because it wasn't until I visited friends in Lynchburg, Virginia, that I learned that the name came from a Quaker judge.
I am aware of that. I think that technically he was an ex-Quaker judge who had been disowned before he became a rather rabid supporter of the American War for Independence. But yes, the Lynches had a number of Quaker ties, and my wife is descended from a branch of that family.
Hmm.
And in fact, Quakers owned the site outside of Lynchburg. A number of Quaker farms eventually would become what's now Liberty University.
Thank you.
Sheldon?
Good evening, Tom, and thank you for your remarks. You mentioned early on the name of Bayard Rustin, and as today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the influence of Bayard Rustin as a scholar and Quaker and man behind the throne, if I may put it that way, was profound. Do you see in this time period, let's say between 2000 and the present, anyone else who has the kind of charisma and vision and that Bayard Rustin contributed to interracialism and in other ways, many other ways?
He's certainly an extraordinary person. And as I noted, it says something about Quakerism in the 1920s that as he was coming of age, he decided to stick with Friends.
Mm-hmm.
Grana?
Thank you. Tom, thank you so much. This is just amazing in so many ways. And I'm just beginning to try to digest it all. I read Fire in the Heartland, and it struck me that the whole context of the 20s, at least up through the 28, 29 period, it's not just a fire in the heartland. This is a wave of racism haunting every single state in this country. And so providing that context politically, I think it's just is critical and crucial to your argument. So in any event, it's going to take me a long time to digest what I've just heard. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chuck?
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate your information here. I was looking for some reference to folks from the Hicksite stream, particularly the left, that I didn't. Like, for instance, Henry Wilbur, who was the first employee of FTC, and Jesse Holmes, who was a professor at Swarthmore for what, 30 some years. And the reason that I was hoping to or expecting to hear about them, because for instance, Henry Wilbur was, although we don't know enough about him, in my opinion, he made a special tour of the South and came back and reported on that to the Progressive Friends in the presentation. And he told the Progressive Friends that things were really terrible in the South. And I don't remember the year when he did that now, but it had to be before 1914 because he died in 1914. Jesse Holmes, the last time I checked at the Friends Historical Library, although he was on their faculty for close to 40 years, they didn't have any kind of collection or guide to his writings, particularly journalistic, of which there was a great stream. He wrote all the time. Articles as distinct from scholarly publications. His doctorate was, I believe, in physics. But he was an agitator about it, and he was also the clerk of the Progressive Friends at our last outpost at Longwood from 1927 to 1940. And looking at their programs, which were available, they weren't a separate denomination by then. There was sort of an annual forum, not unlike presentations at Friends General Conference plenaries. Every year they had Black speakers. They had W.E.B. Du Bois in 1920. They had Elaine Locke, one of the key figures in the Harlem Renaissance. And they had others that I'd have to look up. There was something happening there, because what their audiences would come from, well, they didn't have formal registrations. They didn't have attendance lists, but other evidence suggests that a lot of them came from the Hicksite world and even some from the Orthodox world in Philadelphia, and they went back there carrying these ideas. And so between Holmes, who was very active in this in his final years, and Henry Wilbur, the early part of the 1900s, there's material here that I think is a significant part of what was happening around, at least in the Philadelphia world there, that I wish we had more of. Also, I want to say a little about North Carolina, since I'm stuck in North Carolina for the last 20 years. There's, to my knowledge, there's really almost no serious research on the record of North Carolina Yearly Meeting with regard to racial matters. In their faith and practice, they had the correct words, which were completely disregarded in practice during the Jim Crow decades. And as late as the late 1960s, one of my choices for an unsung hero that wasn't mentioned is the late Willie Fry, who was a pastor in Winston-Salem, at Winston-Salem meeting right near Wake Forest University. So it's essentially a university meeting. He actually read, he was not really a liberal. He was raised fundamentalist. He read the North Carolina Faith and Practice that had all the correct words about racial equality and took them seriously enough to invite some folks of color to come visit his meeting, not necessarily join, but to come visit worship at Winston-Salem Friends. The upshot was a complete separation in the meeting, where they formed another meeting in the county for people to get away from this fellow who was doing this abominable stuff. And he paid other prices as well. And I know that much about him, but I wonder at whether and how we're going to find out. Are there any other unsung heroes, let's say in North Carolina, which was once one of the largest yearly meetings in the country, or maybe more? Oh, you mentioned this woman Cox. She's an interesting, complicated figure. Maybe there are other interesting, complicated figures we need to know about as well.
Right. Well, just to respond briefly to what you said, Chuck, I know a bit about Henry Wilbur. I didn't include him because he died in 1914, but certainly he may have laid some groundwork that later Friends built on. Holmes certainly is all over the Friends Intelligencer in the 1920s, but he doesn't have that much to say about race. He comes to interracial conferences, but most of his writings are on economics or peace. Yeah, no question that the Progressive Friends, the annual meeting at Longwood, racial justice is always on the agenda along with other reforms. To what extent that informs the growing involvement of Friends in the Philadelphia area in other interracial work isn't clear to me at this point. In the case of Clara Cox, there is a fairly large collection of her papers at Guilford College that I've just dipped into. And it would be a really good project, I think, for someone to look at this person who, on the one hand, can condemn white supremacy and, on the other hand, uphold segregation.
Jim, I see your hand. Let's make these comments and questions brief so that we can get in as much as we can.
Yeah, Tom, one more thing that did happen in the 1920s was the All Friends gathering in London, where the conference overall was focused on peace and avoiding another world war. But one of the sessions was about race as a factor in war and making and racial peace. It seems like some of the most important speakers at that session were from India, which is a whole fascinating element in this, because some of those Indian Quaker adjacent people come to the United States. But I was wondering if you found any of the names that you've highlighted in your paper today had attended that All Friends gathering in London in 1920, and in particular in the interracial session of that gathering.
That's an excellent point, Jim, because Hollingsworth Wood was one of the speakers in that session that was about race and colonialism, and had originally been an appeal from an Indian Quaker for British Friends to be supportive of the Indian independence movement. But Wood spoke briefly and basically said that he stood before Friends as an American as ashamed because of the outbreaks of violence, mob violence, that had swept across the United States in 1919. And Rachel Davis Du Bois was also there, and she said later that was her introduction to race as an issue in the United States. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Jessica?
Thank you. I'm in Oregon and I've been studying the life of Daniel Drew. And you mentioned California Friends in passing. There's probably not much more to say, but do you have any more information about what was going on in the 20s with Friends in the West and African American concerns?
My sources for that have been limited to looking at the minutes of California yearly meeting and Oregon yearly meeting and the periodical, The Pacific Friend. And you find occasional condemnations of lynching there. But my sense is that when friends on the West Coast are thinking about interracial issues, they're usually focused either on Mexicans or the Japanese. They just don't have much to say about African Americans.
Thank you.
All right, friends, I'm gonna invite Gretchen now if she has any concluding thoughts and remarks. And yeah, Gretchen.
Well, thank you, Brown. I just appreciate this so much. It's so important to understand our history. And this is a specific time period that really a lot changed in that time period. So it's been fascinating, Tom, to hear your research in this. I'd love to come back next week and do the next 10 years and, you know, and on. But it's so important to know our history and to appreciate both the difficulties and things that we need to be forgiven for and the things that we have historically stood up for. And just thinking about this day, Martin Luther King Day, and the things today that we need to be forgiven for and be happy to stand up for. So I just invite us all to have that thoughtfulness today on Martin Luther King Day as we learn about our history. Tom, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, friends. Please check your emails. This link will be ready in a day or so, and I'll send it out. We're also having Wilson lectures in February in celebration of the Black History Month. We're doing this at ESR, and we'll be doing this virtually. So please watch your emails for my invitations and registrations. Let's keep these discussions going. Thank you for coming. God bless you wherever you are. Stay warm.
Many thanks, Brown.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Mhm.